The empath walks into the room and knows immediately that someone is lying. Not from words, not from evidence, from something they can feel in their body like a shift in air pressure before a storm. They've had this ability their entire life. And their entire life, they've been punished for it. Told they're too sensitive, told they're imagining things, told to stop reading into everything. Meanwhile, every perception they've ever had about someone's hidden truth has eventually been confirmed. Every single one. Carl Jung spent decades working with people exactly like this. Patients who walked into his office describing perceptual experiences that other psychiatrists would have dismissed as delusion or anxiety. But Jung didn't dismiss them. He listened. He tested their perceptions against reality. And what he found shook the foundation of everything he understood about human consciousness. These people weren't delusional. They weren't anxious. They possessed genuine spiritual abilities that operated through psychological channels most people didn't even know existed. Jung called these abilities spiritual, not because they were mystical or supernatural, but because they emerged from the deepest layer of the human psyche, what he called the collective unconscious. The part of consciousness that connects every human being to patterns, archetypes, and information that transcends personal experience. And empaths, he discovered, had unusual access to this layer. They could perceive through it in ways that gave them capacities most people would never develop, no matter how hard they tried. Today I'm going to show you the specific spiritual abilities Jung identified in empaths, why these abilities are rooted in the deepest structures of the psyche rather than in simple emotional sensitivity, how most empaths misuse or suppress these abilities in ways that cause tremendous suffering, and the exact framework Jung developed for wielding these capacities as genuine power rather than being destroyed by them. Because here's the problem Jung kept encountering. Empaths possessed extraordinary abilities, but almost none of them knew what those abilities were, how they worked, or how to use them without being consumed in the process. They were like someone handed a precision instrument with no instruction manual, trying to use it as a blunt weapon, and wondering why it kept cutting them instead. To understand why empathic abilities are spiritual rather than merely psychological, you need to understand what Jung meant by the collective unconscious, and why empaths access it differently than other people. Jung discovered that beneath the personal unconscious, your individual memories, repressions, and experiences, there exists a much deeper layer of psyche that belongs to no one individually, but to humanity as a whole. This layer contains what he called archetypes, universal patterns of experience, behavior, and meaning that have been shaped by millions of years of human existence. Everyone has access to the collective unconscious. It's what makes myths, dreams, and symbols resonate across cultures. But most people's access is filtered, indirect, occasional. They might touch it in dreams or during moments of profound emotion. Empaths, Jung found, had a thinner barrier between their conscious awareness and this collective layer. They weren't just sensing individual emotions, they were tapping into archetypal patterns, universal human dynamics that played out through the specific people around them. This is why empaths often describe knowing things they shouldn't be able to know. They're not reading minds. They're perceiving archetypal patterns that operate beneath the surface of every human interaction. The mother wound, the betrayal pattern, the abandoned child, the false authority. These aren't abstractions to an empath. They're living, breathing realities they can feel radiating from people like heat from a furnace. Jung recognized that this access created abilities that went far beyond emotional sensitivity. He documented 5 specific capacities that genuine empaths possessed, each one rooted in their connection to the collective unconscious, each one extraordinarily powerful, and each one consistently misused in ways that turned the gift into a curse. The first ability Jung identified was what he called archetypal perception. Most people see individuals. They meet someone and they see that specific person, their words, their expressions, their apparent intentions. Empaths see something else entirely. They see the archetype operating through the person. They meet someone and immediately perceive whether this person is operating from the wounded child, the tyrant, the martyr, the trickster, the devouring mother, the absent father. This isn't metaphor for the empath. It's direct perception. They can feel the archetype as clearly as you feel temperature. They walk into a family gathering and see exactly which mythological drama is playing out beneath the small talk. The scapegoat, the golden child, the enabler, the persecutor. These roles aren't intellectual concepts to the empath. They're visible patterns that overlay every interaction like a second reality laid on top of the first. Jung found this ability developed because empaths' nervous systems were forced to become extraordinarily sensitive to patterns early in life. A child growing up in an unpredictable environment doesn't just learn to read individual emotions. They learn to read the underlying story that generates those emotions. They learn to perceive the drama beneath the drama, the archetype beneath the person. Because understanding the deeper pattern was the only way to predict what would happen next and protect themselves accordingly. But here's where most empaths go wrong with archetypal perception. They see the archetype and they respond to the archetype instead of the person. They perceive the wounded child operating through their partner and start mothering their partner. They see the lost soul in a stranger and feel compelled to guide them. They recognize the martyr pattern in a friend and take on the role of savior. They match the archetype with its complementary role and get locked into a mythological drama that isn't theirs to play. Jung was clear about this. Perceiving archetypes doesn't mean you need to participate in them. Just because you can see that someone is unconsciously acting out the abandoned child doesn't mean you need to become their rescuing parent. The ability exists so you can understand what's happening at the deepest level, not so you can get recruited into someone else's unconscious story. The correct use of archetypal perception is recognition without recruitment. You see the pattern, you understand the dynamic, you name it internally, and then you choose consciously whether to engage, how to engage, and what role you're willing to play. The key word is choose. Without archetypal perception, you'd get pulled into these dramas unconsciously. With it, you can see the drama for what it is and decide whether participation serves you or destroys you. This transforms the empath from an unconscious actor in everyone else's mythological story into a conscious witness who can navigate archetypal dynamics without being consumed by them. Jung observed that empaths who mastered this distinction developed what he called archetypal immunity, the ability to perceive the deepest patterns operating in any situation without losing themselves inside those patterns. The second ability Jung documented was somatic knowing. Empaths didn't just sense information through their minds, they received it through their bodies. A tightening in the chest when someone was being dishonest, a wave of nausea around someone with hidden malice, a warmth in the hands near someone who was genuinely safe. Their bodies operated as receivers, translating information from the collective unconscious into physical sensations that carried meaning. Jung found this ability fascinating because it bypassed the conscious mind entirely. The empath's intellect might be fooled by a convincing performance, but their body never was. A charming manipulator could say all the right things, and the empath's mind might want to believe them, but their stomach would clench, their shoulders would tighten, their throat would close. The body was reading something the mind couldn't access directly, and it was always more accurate than conscious assessment. This somatic knowing evolved from the same survival mechanism that created all empathic abilities. Children in volatile environments learn to read danger through their bodies before their minds can process what's happening. The spike of adrenaline before a parent's outburst, the gut feeling that something terrible is about to happen, the physical recoil from someone who appears friendly but isn't safe. These body-based responses become extraordinarily refined over years of childhood hypervigilance. But Jung found that empaths had developed a deeply destructive relationship with this ability. They felt the somatic signals clearly, then immediately overrode them with rational thought. Their body would scream danger, and their mind would say, "Don't be ridiculous, they seem nice." Their stomach would knot around someone, and they'd tell themselves, "You're just being anxious." Their chest would tighten in a relationship, and they'd decide, "This is my attachment issues, not real information." This pattern of receiving accurate somatic information and then dismissing it was, in Jung's observation, the single most damaging thing empaths did to themselves, because the body's knowing came from a layer of consciousness deeper and more accurate than rational thought. When the empath overrode their somatic knowing with intellectual justification, They were choosing a less reliable system over a more reliable one, and they paid for it every time. The correct use of somatic knowing requires what Jung called body authority. The empath learns to treat their body's responses as primary data rather than noise to be overridden. Not as the only data, the mind still has its role, but as the first and most trusted source of information about safety, truth, and alignment. In practice, this means the empath learns to pause when their body responds to someone or something. Instead of immediately rationalizing the sensation away, they sit with it. They let it speak. They ask, what is my body telling me about this person, this situation, this choice? And they take the answer seriously, even when their mind wants to argue with it. Jung observed that empaths who developed body authority made dramatically better decisions about relationships, environments, and life direction. Not because they were smarter, but because they'd stopped ignoring the most sophisticated information processing system they possessed. Their body had been protecting them their entire life. They'd just been too conditioned to distrust it. The third ability Jung identified was temporal sensitivity. Empaths could perceive not just what was happening in the present moment, but what was building beneath the surface toward future expression. They could feel a relationship souring months before any visible signs appeared. They could sense a person's trajectory, where their patterns were carrying them, before any outcomes materialized. They could perceive the early stages of collapse, transformation, or eruption in systems, relationships, and individuals long before anyone else noticed anything was wrong. This wasn't psychic ability in the supernatural sense. Jung understood it as a function of the empath's deep pattern recognition operating across time. Because they perceived archetypal patterns rather than just surface behavior, they could see where those patterns inevitably led. Every archetype has a trajectory. The martyr archetype leads to collapse or resentment. The tyrant archetype leads to isolation or overthrow. The golden child archetype leads to imposter syndrome or crisis of identity. Empaths could feel these trajectories in their body and consciousness, like sensing which direction a river flows. This created one of the most painful aspects of being an empath, living with foreknowledge that no one else shared or believed. They could feel a friend's marriage dissolving while everyone else saw a happy couple. They could sense a colleague heading toward burnout while everyone praised that person's productivity. They could perceive someone's addiction forming before the first visible consequences appeared, and they had to carry this knowledge alone because sharing it made them sound paranoid, pessimistic, or intrusive. Jung found that empaths consistently misused temporal sensitivity by trying to prevent what they perceived. They'd see where someone was heading and try to intervene. They'd warn people about patterns they'd detected. They'd attempt to redirect trajectories they sensed were destructive. And almost universally, these interventions failed and cost the empath dearly. People don't want to know where they're heading when they're not ready to see it. They experience the empath's warnings as judgment, negativity, or control. And the empath ends up rejected and dismissed for the very accuracy that could have helped if anyone had been willing to listen. The correct use of temporal sensitivity, Jung taught, was strategic preparation rather than intervention. You perceive where something is heading, and you use that information to prepare yourself. You feel a relationship deteriorating, and you begin emotionally preparing for its ending rather than desperately trying to save it. You sense someone's trajectory towards self-destruction, and you position yourself safely rather than throwing yourself in front of the train. You feel a system beginning to collapse, and you make plans rather than sounding alarms no one will heed. This isn't cold or uncaring, it's wise. Jung emphasized that the empath's temporal sensitivity existed to protect the empath, not to serve as an early warning system for people who weren't ready to hear warnings. Using the ability for self-preservation rather than futile rescue attempts wasn't selfish. It was the ability functioning as it was designed to function. The fourth ability Jung documented was what he called resonance reading. Empaths didn't just perceive other people's states. They could feel the quality of someone's relationship with themselves. They could sense whether a person was in alignment with their own truth or performing a version of themselves that contradicted who they actually were. They could detect self-betrayal, self-abandonment, and self-deception in others as clearly as hearing a musical note played slightly out of tune. This ability went deeper than perceiving emotions or reading body language. It was the capacity to feel the degree of congruence between someone's presented self and their actual self. The greater the gap between performance and reality, the more intensely the empath felt it. Someone deeply authentic felt like standing in sunlight, warm, clear, easeful. Someone profoundly disconnected from themselves felt like standing in a room where the air was slightly wrong, something the empath couldn't name but couldn't stop sensing either. Jung connected this ability to the empath's attunement to the self, the Jungian archetype representing wholeness and authentic identity. Because empaths had unusual access to the collective unconscious, they could feel the archetypal pull toward authenticity in every person they encountered. When someone was aligned with their true nature, the empath perceived harmony. When someone was betraying their nature, the empath perceived dissonance. And this dissonance was physically and emotionally uncomfortable to be around. This explains something empaths had always known but couldn't articulate: why certain people drained them while others energized them, independent of whether those people were conventionally nice or likable. A blunt, difficult person living authentically could feel restful to the empath. A pleasant, agreeable person performing a false self could feel exhausting. It wasn't about personality, it was about congruence. The empath system was responding to authenticity versus performance at the deepest possible level. Most empaths misused resonance reading by taking responsibility for other people's incongruence. They'd feel someone's self-betrayal and try to help them back into alignment. They'd sense someone's disconnection from their truth and appoint themselves as guide back to authenticity. They'd perceive the gap between who someone really was and who they were pretending to be, and then exhaust themselves trying to close that gap for them. And if you've been carrying other people's dissonance your whole life, trying to tune them back to a frequency they haven't chosen for themselves, that weight you're feeling isn't sensitivity, it's misplaced responsibility. There are 24 reflection exercises in our guide, True Self-Discovery, all rooted in Carl Jung's teachings, designed to help you stop carrying what was never yours and find your own way within. Click below to get True Self-Discovery. Because Jung made something unmistakably clear about resonance reading. You can perceive someone's misalignment with absolute accuracy and still not be able to realign them. That's their work, their journey, their choice. The ability to feel someone's incongruence doesn't make you the mechanic responsible for fixing it. It makes you someone with excellent information about who is safe to stand close to and who will drain you simply by being near them. The correct use of resonance reading is environmental curation. You use your ability to feel congruence and incongruence to consciously choose your environment. You spend time with people whose authenticity your system recognizes and responds to with ease. You limit exposure to people whose performance and self-betrayal your system experiences as draining dissonance. Not because those people are bad, but because prolonged proximity to deep incongruence is genuinely harmful to someone with your perceptual capacity. Jung observed that empaths who learned to curate their environments based on resonance reading experienced a transformation that shocked them. The constant exhaustion lifted, the chronic emotional overwhelm diminished, the feeling of being drained by life itself faded. Because much of what they'd attributed to empathic exhaustion was actually the toll of spending too much time around people whose self-betrayal they were involuntarily perceiving and unconsciously trying to repair. The fifth ability Jung identified was perhaps the most powerful and the most dangerous. He called it shadow illumination. Empaths could perceive not just what people were expressing, but what they were suppressing. They could feel the rage beneath the smile, the terror beneath the confidence, the grief beneath the performance of happiness. They could sense the shadow, the rejected, denied, unconscious parts of someone's psyche, as clearly as they could sense what was being presented. This ability was rooted in the empath's childhood experience of living in environments where the presented reality contradicted the actual reality. The family that performed harmony while seething with conflict, the parent who projected strength while drowning in fear, the household where everything was fine on the surface and everything was breaking underneath. The empath child learned to perceive the shadow because the shadow was the truth and the performance was the lie, and truth was what kept them safe. But shadow illumination created a unique burden. Empaths experienced other people's shadows as their own emotional states. Someone's suppressed rage would register in the empath's body as anger. Someone's denied grief would show up as the empath's sudden sadness. Someone's unconscious shame would manifest as the empath feeling inexplicably ashamed. The shadow material leaked through the performance and landed in the empath system, which couldn't distinguish between its own internal states and the shadow material it was receiving from others. Jung found this was the primary mechanism behind what most empaths called absorbing energy. They weren't absorbing general energy. They were receiving specific shadow content that the other person was suppressing. The more someone denied their shadow, the more forcefully that shadow radiated outward, and the more the empath system picked it up. This is why empaths felt most drained around people who performed the hardest, because heavy performance requires heavy suppression, and heavy suppression means a massive shadow pressing outward. Almost every empath Jung worked with had the same destructive pattern with shadow illumination. They'd perceive someone's shadow and feel drawn to it, not consciously, unconsciously. Something in them resonated with the hidden pain they could feel beneath another person's surface. They'd be drawn to wounded people, toxic people, people carrying enormous unprocessed shadow material. And they'd stay, perceiving the shadow, absorbing it, trying to process it for the other person, believing that their ability to see the wound made them responsible for healing it. This wasn't compassion. Jung was explicit about this. It was the empath's own unresolved wounds, recognizing familiar pain in others and attempting to heal it externally because healing it internally was too frightening. The empath who spent years trying to reach the wounded child inside an abusive partner was almost always avoiding their own wounded child. The empath who could see everyone else's shadow with perfect clarity often had an enormous blind spot when it came to their own. And this was Jung's most important teaching about empathic abilities. Every single one of these capacities, archetypal perception, somatic knowing, temporal sensitivity, resonance reading, shadow illumination, could be used as tools of avoidance just as easily as tools of awareness. The empath who spent all their perceptual energy focused outward, reading everyone else, understanding everyone else, perceiving everyone else's patterns and wounds and shadows, was often doing so because turning that perception inward was terrifying. Because what happens when the empath finally turns their own abilities on themselves? They see their own archetypes in play. They feel their own body's truth about their own choices. They perceive the trajectory of their own patterns. They sense their own incongruence, the gap between who they're performing and who they actually are. They illuminate their own shadow, the parts of themselves they've spent a lifetime projecting onto others rather than integrating. Jung called this the empath's reckoning, the moment when the same abilities they'd been using to navigate the external world had to be directed inward. And he found that this was where most empaths stopped, because perceiving other people's truth was painful but manageable. Perceiving their own truth, their own complicity in toxic dynamics, their own shadow motivations for helping, their own unresolved wounds driving their behavior, was almost unbearable. The empath who could see through everyone else's performance had to see through their own. The one who could detect self-betrayal in others had to confront their own self-betrayal. The one who perceived everyone else's shadow had to stand in front of their own. And Jung found that this moment, this turning of abilities inward, was the dividing line between empaths who were destroyed by their sensitivity and empaths who transformed it into genuine spiritual power. Because when empathic abilities are turned inward, they become tools of individuation, Jung's term for becoming who you actually are rather than who you've been performing. The empath's archetypal perception reveals which archetypal roles they've been unconsciously playing. Their somatic knowing tells them the truth about which choices align with their authentic self and which betray it. Their temporal sensitivity shows them where their own patterns are leading. Their resonance reading reveals the gap between their own presented self and their actual self. And their shadow illumination forces them to confront everything they've been hiding from themselves, while being exquisitely attuned to what everyone else was hiding. This inward turn is the correct use of empathic abilities, according to Jung. Not exclusively inward, the external perception remains valuable for navigation and protection. but primarily inward. The empath's spiritual abilities are meant first for their own development, their own individuation, their own journey toward wholeness. Everything else is secondary. Jung observed that empaths who completed this inward turn underwent a transformation that was visible to everyone around them. They became quieter but more powerful, less reactive but more perceptive, less available to everyone but more present with those they chose. They stopped bleeding their abilities outward into everyone else's problems and started using those abilities to build a life that reflected their actual truth. These empaths developed what Jung called sovereign perception. They could still see everything they'd always seen, the archetypes, the shadows, the patterns, the trajectories. But they were no longer compelled to act on every perception. They could witness without intervening, perceive without absorbing, understand without rescuing, see someone's wound clearly and choose not to treat it, recognize someone's shadow completely and choose not to illuminate it for them, feel the pull of someone's unconscious drama and choose to walk away. This didn't make them cold, it made them free. For the first time in their lives, they could perceive without being enslaved by their perception. They could see without being consumed by what they saw. They could feel without being obliterated by what they felt. Their abilities remained sharp, sharper than ever actually, because they were no longer clouded by the empath's own unprocessed wounds projecting onto every perception. But the abilities served the empath instead of the other way around. Jung emphasized that this transformation required ongoing practice, not a single breakthrough. The empath's tendency to focus perception outward, to prioritize others' pain over their own, to use their abilities for rescue instead of discernment, these were deeply ingrained patterns that resurfaced constantly. The conscious empath wasn't someone who'd eliminated these patterns. They were someone who noticed the patterns arising and chose differently, again and again, sometimes struggling, sometimes failing, but always returning to the practice of directing their abilities inward before outward. He described several practices that facilitated this. The first was what he called perceptual inventory. At the end of each day, the empath reviews the perceptions they received. What did they sense in others? What did their body tell them? What patterns did they recognize? And critically, which of those perceptions did they act on? Which did they override? And which led them to abandon their own needs in service of someone else's unconscious material? This inventory builds self-awareness about how the abilities are being used. Most empaths discover that the majority of their perceptual energy goes outward, into reading, assessing, and responding to others. The inventory reveals this imbalance and creates the possibility of redirecting attention inward. The second practice was shadow journaling, using their shadow illumination ability on themselves, writing about the parts of themselves they'd rather not see, the manipulative tendencies they hid behind helping, the control they disguised as care, the superiority they masked as compassion, the avoidance of their own wounds they dressed up as dedication to healing others. Jung found that empaths who journaled honestly about their own shadow material experienced rapid psychological integration because their ability to perceive shadow was so refined. They just needed to stop pointing it exclusively at everyone else. The third practice was somatic dialogue, sitting in stillness and letting the body speak without the mind overriding it, feeling what the body actually held, not emotions absorbed from others, but the empath's own stored grief, rage, fear, and longing. Jung found that many empaths had never actually felt their own emotions because they were so flooded with everyone else's. Learning to sit in silence, clear the perceptual channels of external input, and finally feel their own interior landscape was often overwhelming and profoundly healing simultaneously. The fourth practice was conscious boundary as spiritual discipline. Not just setting boundaries with people, practicing the internal boundary between perception and action, perceiving someone's pain without moving to fix it, sensing someone's shadow without feeling compelled to illuminate it, recognizing a pattern without needing to announce it. This internal boundary training transformed the empath's relationship with their abilities because it broke the automatic link between perceiving and responding. It created a space between seeing and acting that didn't exist before, and in that space, choice became possible. Jung's ultimate framework for empathic abilities came down to a principle that sounds simple but takes a lifetime to embody. Your abilities are instruments of consciousness, not instruments of rescue. They exist to help you perceive reality accurately so you can live in alignment with truth. They don't exist to make you responsible for everyone else's relationship with reality. When empaths understood this, really understood it, not just intellectually but in their bones, their entire experience of their abilities shifted. The exhaustion lifted because they stopped processing everyone else's unconscious material. The overwhelm diminished because they stopped trying to act on every perception. The isolation eased because they started directing their abilities toward building genuine connection with other conscious people rather than pouring their perception into unconscious ones who couldn't receive it. And something unexpected happened. Their abilities got stronger, not weaker, not dulled by boundaries, sharper. Because when the empath stopped wasting perceptual energy on rescue missions and external focus, that energy became available for deeper perception. They could see further, feel more accurately, perceive more subtle patterns. The abilities that had been operating at 50% capacity because the other 50% was consumed by others' unconscious material began operating at their full potential. Jung described this as the empowered empath, not empowered by learning new techniques or developing new abilities, but empowered by finally using the abilities they'd always had, as those abilities were designed to function. For themselves first, for discernment rather than rescue, for truth rather than comfort, for conscious choice rather than automatic response. This is what makes empathic abilities genuinely spiritual in Jung's framework. Not that they're supernatural or mystical, but that they connect the empath to the deepest layers of human experience, to archetypal patterns that have shaped consciousness for millennia, to truths that most people spend their lives avoiding. The empath's perception touches something sacred, the raw, unperformed truth of human existence. And learning to hold that perception with wisdom rather than being overwhelmed by it is one of the most demanding spiritual disciplines Jung ever encountered. He compared it to other contemplative traditions. The mystic learns to hold expanded awareness without losing themselves in it. The empath faces the same challenge with interpersonal perception. The goal isn't to shut down the perception. That would be like asking the mystic to stop seeing. The goal is to develop the psychological container strong enough to hold what the perception reveals without being shattered by it. And that container is built through the inward practices, the shadow work, the boundary training, the ongoing commitment to using abilities for consciousness rather than codependence. If you're an empath who has spent your life feeling overwhelmed by what you perceive, drained by the constant flow of other people's shadow material through your system, exhausted by the gap between what you can see and what anyone else is willing to acknowledge, Jung would tell you this: nothing is wrong with your abilities. Everything is wrong with how you've been taught to use them. Or more accurately, no one ever taught you to use them at all. You've been navigating with extraordinary perceptual equipment and zero training, and the fact that you've survived this long is testament to the resilience that lives alongside your sensitivity. Your abilities are real. Your perceptions are accurate. The things you've seen in people that no one else seemed to notice, you weren't making them up. The somatic signals your body has been sending that you've overridden 1,000 times, those were trustworthy. The trajectories you've sensed, the shadows you've perceived, the archetypal patterns you've recognized, all of it was genuine perception operating through channels most people don't possess. But those abilities were never meant to be poured into everyone else's healing. They were meant to be turned inward first, used for your own individuation, your own shadow work, your own journey toward the kind of wholeness that Jung spent his life trying to help people find. The external perception is valuable. It protects you, informs you, guides your choices about who and what to allow into your life. But the deepest purpose of your empathic abilities is the perception of your own truth, the illumination of your own shadow, the recognition of your own archetypal patterns, the courage to feel your own body's knowing about your own life. That's the spiritual power Jung identified in empaths, not the ability to feel everyone else's pain, the ability to perceive truth, and the courage to start with your own. If you haven't yet, check out our guide, True Self-Discovery. 24 practical reflection exercises rooted in Carl Jung's teachings, built for exactly this inward turn, for finding your own way within rather than losing yourself in everyone else's journey. Click below to get true self-discovery.